If you own properties that are a leasehold property, for instance, an apartment, okay? All apartments in England are leasehold. That means you own the property, but you don't own the land or the grounds on the property. Then you're going to be pretty happy because the king has just done a speech. In fact, in England and Wales, they are going to abolish all leasehold houses altogether. So there will not be any new leasehold houses built in England and Wales. So what does that mean exactly? Well, I'm going to explain in this video what it means. It's very complicated. So I've done a lot of reading. I've done a lot of research. I've read the bill. I've watched the speech. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about what's going to be happening, why it's happening, and how it's going to affect you as a property investor. So first, let me just explain, if you don't know anything about this, let me explain what a leasehold property is. So if you buy a house and it's leasehold, that means that you're buying the house, but you don't own the land that the house sits on. So if you're buying a property and it's a leasehold property, the very first question that you need to ask is, well, how long is the lease? If the lease is long, let's say it's 100 years, then you're pretty okay. If the lease is short, like 10 years or 20 years, the lease won't outlive you. That means at the end of the lease, unless you've paid to renew the lease, then you'd effectively lose the house because you don't own the land that the house sits on, so you have to give it back to the freeholder. So there's massive changes to this right now. Also, when you're scrolling up properties on Rightmove and you suddenly see a house, and it's like, oh my gosh, they're all selling for £300,000, but this one's selling for £200,000. Why is it so cheap? And then you'll see, it's a leasehold house. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, it means the same thing. It means that you're buying the house, but you're not buying the land. So now it's okay, well, how do I value it? It's more difficult. What happens if the lease is short? If there's only 50, 60 years left on the lease? If it's only less than 80 years, that's going to be, you're going to be probably buying it 30% at least below market value. But it's not really below market value. It's cheap because the lease is short. So this is all changing. For houses, it's going to be abolished altogether moving forward. No more new houses that are built. The developer can't build it as a leasehold. It's banned. If it's an apartment, if you own an apartment like I do, I own many apartments, and it's leasehold, they're not banning leasehold properties, but they are changing many aspects to it. So let me talk a little bit about some of the things that have put me off buying apartments. The first thing that's put me off buying apartments is apartments often have restrictions, like head lease restrictions. So the freeholder will say, you can't do this, you can't rent it out like this, and they'll have a lot of say over the management of the property. So that's the first thing that slightly annoys me about flats. If I'm buying a flat, I think, okay, the freeholder could be a jerk, and the management company, and it can be difficult and it can be awkward. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the cost. I'm having to pay ground rent to the freeholder every year. I'm also having to pay service charge. What's the difference between ground rent and service charge? So ground rent is an amount of money that you have to pay to the freeholder just for being the freeholder. It's just rent because you don't own the land, so you're renting the land. But the service charge, so if you own an apartment, for example, what about if there's a lift in the apartment block? Who's going to pay for the running of that lift? Is the freeholder going to pay for it because he owns the apartment block, but you just own the apartment? Like all the communal spaces is not owned by the apartment owners, right? So who pays for the running of the lift? And the answer is the people that own the apartments do, because they pay a service charge. Who pays for the cleaners? Who pays for the paint on the communal areas every couple of years when there's to be a paint job? Who pays for that? It's the service charge. So if you own an apartment, not only do you have often jerks as management at the management company with covenants and restrictions who make it difficult and run the show, but also you've got to pay rent to them. And you've got a service charge. And the service charge can change. I've had this, right? And also you have no control over how much it is and exactly how it's being used. So it's very difficult to work out your return on investment. Because if your return on investment, if you're buying a house, freehold house, you own the house, you own the land, you own everything. No freeholder, no one to answer to, no rent to pay because you own everything. No service charges because you own everything, so you're in control of how much you pay. If that's the case, it's very easy to work out what your return on investment is going to be, because you can say, my rent's this, right? This is how much my costs are going to be. This is this. But when you have no control, it's difficult to work it out. And it's also something that will often kill your return on investment as well, because it's like, oh wow, the service charge is so high, the ground rent's so high. So these are things that really put me off buying apartments because they're leasehold. I'm not saying that I've never done it. I do own some apartments on leasehold, but it's been a pain. The fourth thing, which is a huge thing, is the fact that you don't actually own the land. And that means that you're renting it, and you have a lease and an amount of time that you rent it for, and you have to renew that lease. I just had to renew a lease. I paid £22,000 I had to pay to renew my lease before it dropped below the 80 year threshold where it suddenly loses loads of value. So if you own a property and you're having to renew the lease, and knowing that that property, when you pass down to your kids, they're going to have to at some point renew the lease and pay a load of money. And it's really expensive extending the lease on a leasehold property. So that's a real killer. And the final thing is that it can take forever to sell. I had a situation where I was trying to sell one of my crappy leasehold apartments, which had not gone up in value for like 10 years, which is another horrible thing about apartments. They often don't go up in value. And I was selling this apartment, and it took forever to sell because I needed certain information from the freeholder, and the freeholder was holding on to the information not freely, and I was struggling to get information. So it took about 4 or 5 months to sell, and I wanted the money quite quickly. I was selling it in lockdown. Sold that for a loss, irritating. But anyway, what are the changes? So houses aren't going to be leasehold anymore. You can't build any leasehold houses. But apartments in England, they're not banning leasehold. They're not going to ban it. I think in Scotland they did. In Scotland, that there is no such thing as leasehold. I don't think there's any leasehold properties in Scotland. Certainly, if you buy an apartment, you'll be buying the apartment. It's not leasehold. I think it makes sense because the communal areas, I kind of get it, but they're changing the rules massively. So this is what they're saying. The King announced, and this isn't law yet, but this is very, very likely to come in probably, first part of next year. So the first thing is they're saying that ground rent they're going to make zero, so you don't have to pay any ground rent. Well, that's huge. Service charge they're bringing down. They're bringing accountability, so you have more control over what's happening, more transparency, more accountability over where the money's going, more control over things like the head lease restrictions, so that you have more say in things. But massively, they're reducing the cost dramatically by how much it costs to extend the lease. So some case studies that I've looked at, it's like almost half the amount to extend it. So I've now got some apartments now that I was looking to extend. A couple of months ago, they flagged up and it was, I'll probably need to extend the lease soon. Now I think I might hold off a few months because of these new changes, and I might save a load of money. Also, they're saying that now when you extend the lease and you pay to extend it, not only is it going to be cheaper, but instead of extending it for 90 years, when you extend it, they're going to extend it for 990 years, which is just ridiculous. If you've got a leasehold property, but you've got the lease for 990 years, you've got control, you've got flexibility, you're paying no ground rent, and the service charge that you are paying, you can see exactly where it's going. And I mean, it's almost as good as freehold. So if you're a leasehold property owner, I think this is really, really, really good news. I also think, here's my prediction of how it's going to potentially affect the property market. So I told you earlier that apartments just didn't go up in value. They haven't gone up in value for many, many years. I mean, you can look back. In the 90s, they did. My rationale behind that, I genuinely think that the series Friends, which was worldwide famous and obviously very good, very popular, they lived in an apartment right in New York. And I think that Friends in the 90s kind of made it cool to live in an apartment, because in the 90s, after apartments rocketed in value. Look at the, even compared to houses, like they became really fashionable. And then when we had the crash, 2008 crash, apartments crashed, houses crashed, apartments just didn't really recover. I mean, as I mentioned, I bought an apartment in Warsaw. I can't remember the exact figures, but for around about 80 grand in 2010 kind of time. And then in lockdown in 2020, when I needed a little bit of cash, I needed a cash injection to the business. I was like, man, I'm selling some of these apartments because they're horrible. But some of the apartments, I sold them for a loss. Like I bought them I own them unencumbered, so I didn't have mortgages on them, thank God. Otherwise, there'd have been a negative equity. But I bought them for like 80 grand and ended up selling for like 65, 70 grand. And I was thinking, how in 10 years have houses doubled and apartments gone down? Like, what's happening? And I think it's because they became unfashionable, mainly because of how difficult it was having a freeholder. You know, the service charge. I've been teaching against buying apartments. I've been saying, don't do it. It's a nightmare with the freeholders and the service charges and the ground rent, having to extend the lease. Like, it's quite, I mean, unless you really know what you're doing. But if you don't really know what you're doing, it's much safer and easier and simpler to just buy a house and rent it out. But I think that these new changes are going to make it probably more popular to buy apartments again. And hopefully, if the freeholders lax off a little bit potentially on short stay lets, maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself right now, but you know, apartments work really well as serviced accommodation on short stay lets. And if you pay no ground rent and you've got a 990-year lease, yeah, it could be quite exciting. Maybe we'll see apartments suddenly go up in value. So if you're an apartment owner in England, you know, it's probably pretty good news. I'm going to leave a link in the description with two things. Firstly, I'm going to leave a link in the description where I've got my information, which came straight as a result of the King's speech. It's page number 45 if you want to read in a bit more detail, and it will summarise what I've just said. And then number two is I'm going to put a link for my property investors crash course. So it's £1 to get a ticket, and we can spend the day together finding apartments, finding houses, and absolutely finding the best property investments as we enter into 2024.